Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take those big, complex subjects, dig through the sources, and pull out the insights you need to really understand them. Now, when you think of Rome, probably images of legions marching, maybe the Colosseum, emperors in charge, that sort of thing.
Yeah, the standard picture, bronze armor, grand buildings, absolute power.
But that image, that surface-level view, it really only tells part of the story, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a crucial point. Rome's incredible endurance, its sheer scale, it rested on, well, a kind of duality. On one hand, you had this brilliant, very adaptable system of government and religion, too, highly structured.
Okay.
But underpinning all of that was an economic engine, just as vast, just as relentless, and often, let's be honest, unbelievably brutal.
And that engine was slavery.
Oh,
Human chattel slavery.
that was the engine, yes.
So that's our mission for you today. We're going to pull apart these foundational pieces, the way power worked, the role of religion, and these deep social structures that really defined Rome's rise, how it functioned, and how it eventually changed.
Yeah.
We'll look at the origin stories, how emperors gathered power figures like Augustus, Trajan. We'll unpack Rome's really unique approach to religion, how flexible it was, and then, yeah, we have to dive into the harsh reality of the labor market that fueled everything.
Built the roads, fed the legions, quarried the marble.
Exactly. We're starting right at the beginning. But just a heads up, Rome's foundation story isn't exactly gentle shepherds and peaceful cooperation.
No, it's potent.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with this violent, almost strange foundation story that Rome itself not only accepted, but actively promoted.
Yeah, if you want to get the Romans, you kind of have to start there. You have to accept their own origin story as well. It's fundamentally violent. And they saw that violence as integral, part of their identity from day one.
And our sources show this violence was immediately tied up with the divine, with religion. When Romulus and Remus decided to found their city, the first thing they did was consult the gods using augury.
Right, that's a classic Roman religious practice, divination, basically. Watching birds, interpreting natural signs, it was a fundamental step anchoring the whole project, the state's legitimacy, in getting the ritual right.
But the ritual itself led straight to conflict.
Immediately. The brothers argue, maybe over how to read the signs, maybe over where exactly the city walls should go, and the result? Romulus kills Remus right over the walls he'd just started building.
So fratricide, killing your own brother, is literally built into the foundation myth.
Baked right in. And it wasn't just some unfortunate accident in the story. It sort of symbolized the constant civil conflict, that readiness for really brutal internal competition that haunted Roman politics for centuries, long before Caesar, you know.
And Romulus didn't stop there. He immediately set up institutions that were about expansion and bringing others in, often forcefully. He starts the Consualia festival.
Invites the neighbors, particularly the Sabines.
And then his men carry off their women. The rape of the Sabine women. It's
Yeah.
a brutal story of assault.
Absolutely horrific. But the Roman narrative, well, it twists it pretty quickly into a story of forced cultural assimilation. They take the women, and they forge alliances, create a new, stronger people out of that violence. It's a pattern.
He also makes that link between war and the gods' favor explicit, right?
Definitely. As a war leader, Romulus takes the spolia opima, the best spoils, won in single combat, and he founds Rome's first temple, dedicated to Jupiter Feretrius. So right away, military victory is proof of divine backing.
And the story ends with him vanishing, becoming a god himself, Quirinus, setting this precedent. Successful leaders are touched by the divine.
A very powerful precedent. And it paved the way for the next phase, where the early kings started laying down the actual blueprint for a functioning state, religiously and political.
After the warrior Romulus, you get Numa Pompilius, his Sabine successor. And he's the complete opposite, almost, the pious king.
He really is the perfect contrast. Numa's credited with the core religious stuff, the first proper Roman calendar, key priesthoods, the warrior dancers, the Salii, the specialized priests called flamines, and incredibly important, the Vestal Virgins.
Keepers of the sacred flame.
Essential to the city's well-being. And Numa embodied peace through piety. The symbol for this was the Temple of Janus.
The one with the doors, open in wartime, closed in peace.
That's the one, massive bronze doors. And the sources tell us they stayed shut throughout Numa's entire reign. It symbolized this deep, sustained peace rooted in correct religious observance. Later on, closing those doors became this huge symbolic act, almost mythical, rarely achieved until Augustus.
We also see outside influences shaping the state religion early on, the Etruscans, for instance.
Yes, the Etruscan kings left a major mark. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, one of the later kings, he founded the massive Capitoline temple dedicated to that famous triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva.
The Capitoline Triad.
That temple and that specific group of gods became the absolute model for the highest official state cult across the entire Roman world. Wherever Rome went, you'd find a Capitolium.
So how did this state religion manage to work as Rome grew into this huge empire? It seems like it would need to adapt.
That's exactly it. It had to be flexible. As Rome became this, well, super state, its religious system couldn't be rigid or exclusive. It needed to be an inclusive network of lawful cults.
So if you conquered a place, you didn't necessarily stamp out the local gods.
Not usually, no. You'd often accommodate them, find parallels, or even officially incorporate them. The divine job description for a Roman god could expand or overlap with local traditions. Jupiter, the top god, for example, he absorbed aspects from older gods like Mars and Quirinus, but eventually, in that main Capitoline triad, he's paired with Juno and Minerva, more sophisticated urban deities.
That makes sense. It allows people in the provinces to keep their own ways but still be part of the bigger Roman religious framework, the Pax Diorum.
Exactly. Maintaining that peace of the gods was paramount, and the physical rituals reflected this public state function.
Right. You mentioned ceremonies were outdoors.
Yeah.
Not inside the temple building itself.
Correct. The main action, the sacrifice, happened at an open-air altar within the sacred boundary, the templum. The cella, the inner room with the statue, wasn't where the public worship happened. The whole community could see the ritual, participate in that sense. It reinforced the connection between the people, the state, and the gods.
And the sacrifices themselves were very specific, depending on who you were addressing.
Incredibly specific. You had the dei subterrae, the gods above, the sky gods like Jupiter and Juno. You honored them in daylight. The victims had to be white, usually infertile. Jupiter, for his main festival, demanded a white castrated ox.
The specific requirement.
Very. And after the sacrifice, there was a shared meal. The officials, the priests, they'd eat the meat. The gods got their share, the vital organs, or exta, consumed by the altar fire. It was a communal act.
Okay, but then there were the other gods, the ones below.
The Dei and Fairy, the chthonic gods, powers of the underworld and the earth. Their rituals were almost a mirror image, deliberately kept separate.
How so?
These were done at night. The victims had to be dark-colored and fertile, like a pregnant cow for Tellus, the Earth Mother, and the sacrifice was typically a holocaust.
Meaning everything was burned.
Everything. The whole animal, and critically, absolutely no shared banquet.
Why not?
The logic was stark and very Roman. The living cannot share a meal with the dead. That boundary was sacred, absolute. Mixing those spheres was dangerous.
Wow. But you mentioned one thing that connected all sacrifices, something the Vestals prepared.
Ah, yes. The mola salsa. It sounds so simple, just salted flour, coarse ground, but the Vestal virgins prepared it and it was sprinkled on every single victim in every sacrifice, public or private.
What's the significance of that?
It's key. It links the most basic domestic act, preparing grain and salt, with the highest functions of the state religion. It speaks volumes about another crucial Roman concept, the unity of faith and state.
Right. Rome didn't really have a separate class of priests, like in some other cultures.
Not in the same way, especially in the Republic. The top political figures were usually the ones sponsoring the major cults. The office of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest. By the late Republic, it was pretty much expected that a top consul would hold it. Power and piety went hand in hand.
But there were exceptions, weren't there? Priests who couldn't really do politics.
Yes, and that exception proves the rule about how seriously they took ritual purity. The Flamen Dialis, the high priest specifically dedicated to Jupiter, faced an incredible number of restrictions.
Like what?
Oh, he couldn't touch beans or ride a horse or even see knots. He couldn't spend more than 3 nights away from his own bed. These purity rules effectively barred him from any meaningful political or military career. It shows that while politics and religion were usually linked, the demands of certain rituals could be so intense they completely overshadowed personal ambition.
So this whole system, where political power and religious authority are so intertwined, that really sets the stage for the big shift, doesn't it? From the chaos of the Republic to the Empire. the Principate.
Absolutely. The late Republic was, well, it was essentially one giant, often bloody competition for status and public acclaim.
A game of dignitas, status.
Exactly. Played out very publicly. The elite poured fortunes into massive public displays, feasts, festivals called ludi, and especially the games, the gladiatorial contests. These weren't just entertainment. They were tools for building popularity, gaining influence, and ultimately securing those all-important military commands.
And as the Republic fractured into civil war, we see leaders start using religion more directly to legitimize grabbing power for themselves.
Oh, definitely. Julius Caesar took a huge step. He claimed the goddess Venus as his direct ancestor. That's a powerful divine link. And when he maneuvered himself into the position of Pontifex Maximus back in 63 BC, that was a major signal.
It showed he could wield both swords and sacred rights.
Precisely. He was emerging as a force who could command both the earthly and the divine spheres.
Then, after all the chaos, comes Augustus, the first citizen. He really creates the blueprint for how emperors would rule.
He was a political genius, a master of consolidation. He carefully gathered all the key powers, political and priestly, including becoming Pontifex Maximus himself, holding it for life. But he did it cleverly.
Also,
By framing everything as a return to tradition.
Wow.
He wasn't inventing new things, supposedly. He was restoring ancient cults that had fallen into neglect, like the Arval Brotherhood, promoting popular festivals like the Compitalia for the common people.
so making it seem like he was fixing things, bringing back the good old days.
Exactly. His reign wasn't just pitched as ending the civil wars. It was sold as restoring order and, crucially, guaranteeing the Pax Diorum, that peace with the gods. The idea that the emperor's job was to ensure divine favor. That became the core religious and social justification for imperial rule from then on. Every successful emperor had to project that image.
And this imperial setup fueled incredible expansion. We often think of Trajan's reign as the peak, right?
It's often seen that way, yes. Territorially, the empire reached its absolute greatest extent under Trajan. He conquered Dacia, modern Romania, and pushed into Parthia. And those victories are famously recorded on Trajan's column in Rome. That continuous spiral of carving.
A war story in stone.
Pretty much, an epic piece of propaganda.
But his successor, Hadrian, took a completely different approach.
A fascinating shift. Hadrian wasn't about more conquest. He focused on consolidation, defense. You see it literally with Hadrian's Wall up in Britain drawing a line.
But he was also a builder, a cultural figure.
Hugely so. He traveled the empire constantly. He was a massive patron of arts and architecture. Think of the Pantheon in Rome, which he rebuilt, that incredible dome, the oculus open to the sky. It wasn't just about military might anymore. It reflected a commitment to Greek culture, to sophistication, to the permanence of Roman civilization itself.
So the buildings themselves were political statements, like the Colosseum, built by the Flavians after Nero in the Civil Wars, or the aqueducts bringing water into the cities.
Absolutely deliberate propaganda. These weren't just useful structures. They were designed to impress, to show the state's power, its permanence, its ability to provide for its citizens bread and circuses, yes, but also infrastructure, order, sophistication.
But that sense of permanence got shaky later on, the crisis of the 3rd century.
A really rough period, about 50 years of almost constant turmoil. You had invasions from outside, the economy was under immense strain, emperors were being assassinated one after another, and the empire even started to fragment.
Right, like the Gallic Empire in the west, Palmyra in the east, temporary breakaway states.
Exactly. It proved the empire had just become too vast, too complex for one person to manage effectively, especially with threats on multiple frontiers.
Which led to a radical rethinking of how to govern. Diocletian comes along and creates the Tetrarchy.
The rule of 4. A system with 4 emperors ruling at the same time. 2 senior ones, the Augusti, and 2 junior ones, the Caesars.
What was the thinking there?
It was mainly practical. Better defense, you could have an emperor closer to each major trouble spot. And crucially, it was supposed to create a smoother succession. The Caesars would step up when the Augusti retired or died, avoid those destructive civil wars over who gets to be emperor.
Did it work?
Well, it helped stabilize things for a while under Diocletian himself, but the structure, sharing power like that, it was inherently unstable. As soon as Diocletian and his co-Augustus retired, the Caesars started fighting each other, so it ultimately failed in its goal of peaceful succession.
But despite all this internal struggle, Rome had this secret weapon for holding the empire together long-term, didn't it? Something about inclusion.
Yes, that's a really distinct feature of Roman imperialism compared to many others. They generally didn't try to wipe out local cultures or religions when they conquered. They allowed local cults, local calendars to continue.
Which must have made being conquered slightly more palatable.
It certainly fostered what we call Romanization, not by force-feeding Roman culture, but often through mutual benefit and gradual adoption. And the ultimate expression of this inclusive approach was the way they handled citizenship.
How so?
It started quite early. For example, they created a special status, Latin rights, for people like the sons of Roman soldiers and local women in places like Spain. It was a kind of halfway house to full citizenship, but it established a massive principle. You could become Roman, part of the Roman legal and political system, even if you lived hundreds of miles from Italy and didn't speak Latin as your first language.
That idea that Roman identity wasn't tied just to the city of Rome that feels revolutionary.
It really was. And the culmination of this whole process came with Caracalla's edict in AD 212.
What did that do?
It granted full Roman citizenship to every single free inhabitant of the entire empire overnight. We're talking potentially 30 million new citizens.
Wow. Why did he do that? Was it pure idealism?
Probably not entirely. Historians often point to more practical motives. Suddenly, all these new citizens were liable for Roman inheritance taxes and other duties.
Oh.
So it significantly broadened the tax base, which the state desperately needed.
Right.
More revenue.
But regardless of the primary motive, the effect was profound. It fundamentally changed what it meant to be Roman. It universalized the status across this vast, diverse territory.
Okay, so we've seen the grand-scale Trajan's conquests, Hadrian's consolidation, the massive propaganda value of buildings like the Pantheon and Colosseum.
The imperial machine in action.
But, like you said earlier, none of that happens without labor, and the vast majority of that labor wasn't voluntary. We need to pull back that curtain now and look squarely at the engine. Roman slavery. This is where the legal status gets brutally clear.
It's stark. Under Roman law, slaves were defined, quite simply, as property. Things. They completely lacked legal personhood.
And that definition opened the door to, well, everything. Pretty much. It meant they could be bought, sold, beaten, tortured, killed, sexually exploited, with virtually no legal consequence for the owner. Their basic needs, food, shelter, healthcare, were entirely up to the owner's calculation of economic utility. Were they worth keeping alive and healthy, or cheaper to replace?
It's interesting, though, that from a purely economic view, the Roman elite didn't always draw a sharp line between slave labor and free wage labor.
That's a subtle but important point. They often used free people and slaves for the same kinds of jobs, especially in crafts or services. But they tended to look down on anyone who had to work for wages as being dependent, lacking true freedom. So in their minds, the dependence of a wage laborer wasn't philosophically that different from the dependence of a slave, even though the legal reality was night and day.
The scale, though. Just how widespread was slavery?
It was massive, especially in Italy by the late Republic. Estimates vary, naturally, but maybe 20% to 30% of the population. That could be up to 2 million people enslaved just in Italy.
2 million.
But the number that always hits me, the one that really conveys the sheer human cost, is the average age at death recorded for slaves in the city of Rome.
What was it?
Just 17.5 years.
17 and a half? That's unbelievably low. It's barely adulthood.
It's devastating. It suggests a system that just consumed human lives at an industrial pace.
Did the Romans acknowledge this? Was it seen as just the cost of doing business?
The sources often reflect a pretty cynical attitude, yeah. Sometimes it was considered more cost-effective to work a slave to death quickly and buy a replacement rather than investing in their long-term health or well-being. This brutal reality meant the system needed a constant, massive supply of new people.
So where did they all come from?
The single biggest source, especially during the Republic's big expansion phase, was war captives. Conquest meant slaves. Loads of them.
You mentioned Caesar earlier.
Right, that incredible story about the Aduatuci tribe. Caesar besieges them, they surrender, and he sells the entire population, 53,000 men, women, and children, to slave dealers right there on the battlefield. Instant cash, instant labor.
That kind of constant demand must have created huge markets.
Absolutely. Major slave trading hubs emerged. Delos, the island in the Aegean, is the most famous example. It was made a free port in 166 BC, and for decades it became the center of a massive, often piratical, slave trade.
Pirates were involved.
Heavily. The Roman state kind of turned a blind eye for a long time because the pirates were supplying the cheap labor needed for the huge agricultural estates, the latifundia, especially in places like Sicily. Ironically, those same estates packed with desperate slaves became the flashpoints for major slave revolts later.
So war and piracy were huge sources. But it wasn't just people captured abroad, was it? People became slaves within the empire, too.
Tragically, yes. Especially children, often due to poverty or social custom.
Oh.
One major way was infant exposure, expositio. Abandoning unwanted newborns, usually girls. It was common practice, sadly. The Romulus and Remus myth itself is a sanitized version of this.
What happened to exposed infants if they were found?
If they were healthy, they were often picked up, sometimes fostered or adopted, but very often they were raised essentially as an investment. They were expected to work and could be sold later. They often fell into this ambiguous category of alumni.
Alumni, meaning foster children but potentially treated as slaves or apprentices.
Exactly. Their legal status could be very unclear, especially if they came from poor families or were foundlings. And sometimes sheer desperation drove parents to sell their own children into slavery.
Was that legal? Selling your own child?
Technically, Roman law cherished the idea of free birth, so the contract was often voidable. But the reality for the desperately poor was different. And while self-sale into slavery was illegal, liberty was supposedly inviolable, it definitely happened. The law was harsh. If you knowingly tried to give up your citizen rights like that, you were deemed unworthy of them, and the enslavement could become permanent.
It sounds like an inescapable system for many, yet within this, you mentioned there was a way for slaves to have some limited control. The peculium.
Ah, yes, the peculium. This is a fascinating aspect. It was essentially a fund or property that a master would formally set aside for a slave to manage as if it were their own. Legally, it still belonged to the master.
But the slave could use it.
Yes. It probably started simply on farms, maybe a few animals, a small plot of land the slave could work for their own benefit, purely as an incentive to be more productive for the master.
But it developed beyond just farming.
Oh, much further. Especially in urban settings, it became the basis for sophisticated business activities. Slaves used their peculium to run shops, manage workshops, captain small trading vessels, act as agents for their masters.
So it gave them a degree of economic agency.
It did. It was a powerful motivator. For many slaves, accumulating enough peculium to eventually buy their own freedom was the only realistic path out of slavery. But we have to remember the master ultimately benefited. It encouraged hard work, initiative, and the master usually took a cut, all while the slave bore the risk.
But it was possible for slaves to become quite wealthy through this.
Absolutely. We have inscriptions, tombstones set up by freedmen, former slaves, dedicating things to sua pecunia from his own money. It shows they could accumulate significant funds. Often they'd buy their freedom and then continue in the same business, now as a client to their former master, their new patron. It was a complex system, part control, part incentive. And just as the peculium shows complexity, the types of work slaves did varied enormously. It really reflected how sophisticated the Roman economy was, especially in the cities and large estates.
Right. In a wealthy household, you wouldn't just have generic servants.
Not at all. We know from inscriptions, especially tombstones, about incredible specialization. At least 55 different specific jobs have been recorded just for household staff. Highly educated scribes, doctors, accountants, architects, specialized chefs, hairdressers, litter bearers, the list goes on. These people often had skills far exceeding those of many poor free citizens.
But then there's the other end of the spectrum. The really brutal labor.
The absolute inverse. The worst fates were often reserved for those condemned by the state, rather than just bought on the market, particularly the mines and quarries.
Who ended up there?
Often criminals. If a Roman citizen committed a serious crime, they could lose their freedom and be condemned ad metalla to the mines. They became servi pone, slaves as punishment.
And that was basically a death sentence.
Pretty much. They were often permanently tattooed or branded on the forehead, signifying their status. They were expected to live and die right there in the mines. The sources are chillingly clear. For the state, the sheer cruelty was part of the point. It was a deterrent, a display of ultimate state power, alongside the economic value of the extracted minerals.
The state's control mechanisms were terrifyingly effective, especially the threat of collective punishment.
There was a deep, pervasive fear of slave rebellion running through Roman society, especially after the big revolts in the late Republic. This fear led to incredibly harsh laws. There's a famous decree from AD 10.
What did it say?
It stipulated that if a master was murdered by one of his slaves, all the slaves living under the same roof had to be tortured and executed.
All of them, even if they had nothing to do with it.
All of them. In a large aristocratic villa, that could mean hundreds of innocent people killed. It was pure terror as a control mechanism. It ensured that slaves would police each other, that no one would dare tolerate even talk of resistance.
And the ultimate punishment, the one most associated with slaves.
During the Republic especially, that was crucifixion. The servile supplicium, the punishment fit for a slave. It was so tied to slave status that one of the worst accusations you could throw at a corrupt governor, like Cicero did against Verres, was that he had dared to crucify a Roman citizen. It was seen as the ultimate degradation of civic dignity.
Beyond actual legal slavery, you also had certain professions that society just looked down on, placing people in a kind of social limbo.
Yes, the concept of infamia, or disrepute. People in certain professions, gladiators, actors, dancers, prostitutes, were considered infamous. It didn't matter if they were legally free or slaves.
What did being infamous mean in practice?
It meant they lost many legal rights and protections. They couldn't hold office, couldn't represent others in court, and crucially, they were subject to types of physical punishment, like flogging, that were usually reserved only for slaves. Society viewed them as having voluntarily surrendered their bodily integrity for public display or use, whether for entertainment or sex.
You mentioned the fear of rebellion. Were there major uprisings?
Oh yes. The fear wasn't irrational. Rome faced several large-scale slave wars, known as the Servile Wars. The most famous is the Third Servile War, led by Spartacus.
The gladiator.
Exactly. A Thracian gladiator, Spartacus, along with others like Crixus, escaped from their training school in 73 BC. Their revolt grew with astonishing speed. At its peak, they might have commanded an army of 70,000 escaped slaves and dispossessed free people. It took the Roman state years and huge military resources under Crassus and Pompey to finally crush it.
That must have terrified the Roman elite.
Absolutely, and it led to a whole industry focused on recapture. Runaway slaves were legally considered stolen property. There were professional fugitive slave catchers called fugitivaria. It was big business. Even Augustus, in his Res Gestae, his list of achievements, proudly boasts about rounding up and returning 30,000 fugitive slaves to their masters for punishment. It shows the scale of the problem and the resources dedicated to keeping the system intact.
Were there any outlets, any moments where the pressure was released, even temporarily?
There were. Ritual provided some safety valves. The most famous is the Saturnalia festival in December.
What happened then?
It was a period of licensed chaos, of role reversal. Slaves were granted temporary freedom, what they called December liberty. They got to feast, often better than usual. They could gamble, speak freely to their masters, even wear the pileus, the felt cap that symbolized freedom. Some accounts even suggest masters served their slaves during the feast.
A world turned upside down just for a few days.
Exactly. It was a way to let off steam, acknowledge the tensions, but within a controlled, temporary ritual framework that ultimately reinforced the normal order by suspending it briefly.
Did any religions offer slaves a more permanent sense of belonging without challenging the system itself?
Some did. The Mithraic mysteries, for example, were very popular with soldiers, but also, significantly, with slaves and freedmen.
What was Mithraism about?
It was a mystery cult centered on the god Mithras, often depicted slaying a bull. It had levels of initiation, emphasized order, loyalty, hierarchy, themes that resonated with soldiers but also didn't threaten the social structure. We find many inscriptions where imperial slaves or private slaves dedicate offerings to Mithras, often asking for the health and safety of their masters.
So it provided community and spiritual solace, but posed absolutely no threat to the established order.
Precisely, which is why the Roman state largely tolerated it, unlike some other groups later on.
Okay, so as we move into the later Roman Empire, things start to shift. The rise of Christianity must have had an impact on how people thought about slavery.
It did, but perhaps not in the way we might expect today. Christianity certainly introduced a powerful concept of spiritual equality. Slaves were welcomed into the church, they participated in the liturgy alongside the free. There's even strong tradition suggesting several early popes, like Clement I, Pius I, Tilix II, were former slaves or came from slave families.
That must have been radical, that spiritual equality.
In concept, yes, but in practice, the early church didn't mount a direct attack on the institution of slavery itself.
Really? Few theologians argued it was fundamentally wrong.
Very few initially. While some church fathers, like Gregory of Nyssa later on, condemned it quite strongly, and many called for masters to treat their slaves kindly as fellow Christians, the institution itself wasn't widely seen as inherently sinful or needing abolition.
How does someone like Augustine view it?
St. Augustine's view was influential. He came from North Africa, from a background where slave owning was normal among the elite. He saw slavery as being against God's original plan for humanity, yes, but he viewed it as a consequence of sin, part of the fallen nature of the world after Adam. A punishment, in a sense, but not something the church needed to actively dismantle in the here and now. Even in the 5th century, Christian writers like Salvian could still refer to slaves as inherently wicked.
So a complex picture. Moral discomfort, perhaps, but not outright rejection of the economic system.
Pretty much, and this moral ambiguity was starkly clear when it came to sexual ethics.
How so?
Because slaves were property, legally, the owner had almost unlimited sexual access. Traditional Roman morality might frown upon excessive or indiscreet exploitation, but that was more about the owner showing a lack of self-control, a failure of their virtue. It wasn't about the rights or violation of the slave.
The slave had no right to refuse, no legal recourse.
None whatsoever. Their bodies were simply available to the owner. And perhaps the most chilling silence in the sources relates to children.
What do you mean?
Legal historians point this out. There are no surviving Roman legal texts that specifically address the sexual abuse of slave children.
None.
None. The implication is horrifying. Because they were property, and children besides, they likely had no specific legal protection against this whatsoever. They were utterly vulnerable commodities.
This whole system, built on coercion and the denial of personhood, it feels like it eventually starts to bleed into the status of free people, too, as the empire faces more crises.
That's exactly what happens. The lines begin to blur dramatically in late antiquity. The immense pressure on the state for taxes and stability led it to impose controls on its free population that looked increasingly like the controls used on slaves.
You mentioned Diocletian's tax reforms earlier.
Yes, his system tied tax liability not just to the land itself, but to the people registered as living and working on that land. This made it incredibly difficult administratively for peasant farmers, the colony, to leave the land they were registered to. They were becoming tied down.
And then Constantine takes it a step further, the Constantinian shift.
Around AD 332, Constantine issued laws that severely restricted the rights of these tenant farmers, the colony. They were forbidden from leaving the estates where they worked. If they ran away, they could be hunted down, chained, and brought back, forced to work.
That sounds exactly like how they treated fugitive slaves.
It was very similar. This is a crucial turning point. The state, purely for administrative convenience and tax revenue, effectively stripped a large part of the free agricultural population of their freedom of movement, a core right that had always distinguished citizen from slaves.
So, by the 4th and 5th centuries, that fundamental legal line between slave and free citizen, which had defined Rome for a millennium, it's basically dissolving for most people.
It's becoming increasingly meaningless for the vast majority. Instead of that clear slave-free divide, Roman society starts to look different. It bifurcates into two huge groups.
Which were?
You had the tiny elite, the honestiors, the more honorable ones, senators, high officials, the wealthy landowners, and then you had almost everyone else, the humiliors, the lowlier ones, small farmers, artisans, laborers, the urban poor, and increasingly the colony.
And the key thing is how the humiliors were treated.
Exactly. They became subject to harsher laws, summary justice, and crucially, types of punishment like forced labor in mines or public works, corporal punishment that had previously been reserved almost exclusively for slaves. The state's coercive tools, honed over centuries to control slaves, were now being turned inwards onto the majority of its own theoretically free population.
So the distinction collapses, and it paves the way for something new.
It's the systemic beginning of medieval serfdom. The poor farmer, legally free but tied to the land and subject to the landowner's justice and demands for labor, isn't radically different in practice from a late Roman slave on the same estate. The imperial machine, built to exploit conquered peoples and slaves, ended up consuming the liberty of its own citizens.
So, if we try to synthesize this, looking back at the whole picture, Rome starts with this violent myth, Romulus killing Remus.
A foundation in fratricide.
And its entire history seems to be about defining who's in the citizen and who's the slave, the foreigner, the enemy. But that definition kept changing.
Constantly shifting. That's the core dynamic, I think. Rome's genius early on was its radical inclusion, its willingness to turn enemies into allies, foreigners into citizens on an unprecedented scale. That's what fueled its growth.
But at the same time?
At the same time, it built its economy and maintained its order through an equally radical capacity for exploitation: chattel slavery on a massive scale, the brutal subjugation of conquered provinces, the social death of infamia, and eventually, as the empire faced its own limits and crises, that coercive power, that focus on control and extraction, turned inward. The liberty that had once been the hallmark of being Roman was gradually extinguished for almost everyone except the very powerful elite.
Yeah.
The engine of exploitation ended up consuming its own fuel source, in a way. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. From the myths and violence of Rome's founding, through emperors like Augustus building the imperial system, Trajan expanding it, Hadrian consolidating it, and then diving deep into that engine room, the world of Roman slavery. A system that defined who was property, but also, as we saw, blurred lines of work, agency, and eventually freedom itself.
It's a story of incredible contrasts. That capacity for inclusion, extending citizenship so widely, it was revolutionary, but it existed side by side with this immense structural capacity for exploitation. Slavery is the most obvious example, but also the treatment of the humiliores, the people deemed lesser, millions held as property, millions more eventually tied to the land.
So what's the big takeaway here? What does it all mean? It feels like the Romans themselves wrestled with this. Whether the glory of the empire justified the methods used to build and maintain it, the sources sometimes hint at that unease, don't they? The tears mixed with the triumph.
They do. The historian Tacitus, writing about Roman conquest in Britain, put words into the mouth of a British chieftain. A very famous line. Speaking about the Romans, he says, "They make a desert and they call it peace. O fair, jucidar raper, falsis nominibus imperium, atque ubi solitudinem faciunt passum appellant."
They make a desert and call it peace. That's powerful.
It is. And it forces us to ask, doesn't it? When we look at the undeniable achievements, the law, the architecture, the literature, the sheer scale of Roman civilization, how much can we, or should we, separate that glory from the profound violence and the systemic exploitation that made it all possible?
That's the lingering question, isn't it? Reconciling the achievement with the cruelty.
It's perhaps the central tension that makes Roman history still so compelling, so relevant to think about even today. How do societies balance power, order, liberty, and justice, especially when they grow vast and complex? The Romans offer us centuries of examples, both inspiring and deeply cautionary.